The history of rail travel is one of the clearest stories of progress we have. Trains arrived, cities grew, stations were built to serve them. That is the sequence. That is the logic. Infrastructure follows demand. Demand follows population. Population follows time. So here is the first number that matters. Grand Central Terminal in New York City was completed in 1913. On opening day, it could process, simultaneously, 240,000 passengers. In 1913, the entire population of Manhattan was approximately 2 million people. The station was built to handle, in a single day, roughly 1/8 of the city's entire population moving through one building. That is not unusual for a major transit hub, until you look at what the railroads were actually carrying at that moment. Daily rail ridership through the previous station on that site, the one Grand Central replaced, had been steady, functional, manageable. The new structure wasn't built to relieve an overwhelmed system. The system was not overwhelmed. The new structure was built to a scale that the existing ridership could not have justified on paper. Engineers and architects and city planners looked at a functioning rail network and decided to build something 10 times more ambitious than the numbers required. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. What it does is follow a pattern. Slowly, carefully. Because Grand Central is not the anomaly. Grand Central is the example that makes the others visible. When Union Station in Washington, D.C. opened in 1907, it was the largest train station in the world. Its main hall, the main hall, was modeled intentionally on the Baths of Diocletian in Rome. The Baths of Diocletian were built to serve a population of over 1 million people at the height of the Roman Empire. Union Station, at opening, served a city of approximately 280,000 residents. The architectural reference was not accidental. The proportions were not accidental. The vaulted ceilings rising 96 feet. The Roman barrel arches. The coffered detailing requiring craftsmen trained in techniques no longer commonly practiced in American construction at the time. These were deliberate choices made by people who had precise budgets, precise timelines, and access to population data. They chose Roman imperial scale for a city less than 3 decades removed from being a frontier capital. And they were not wrong to do so. Washington, D.C. grew. The station filled. The capacity proved necessary within decades. But that raises the question that sits at the center of this pattern. How did they know? Not in a mystical sense. Not in a conspiratorial sense. In a purely logistical, practical engineering sense, how did the planners of these structures calculate demand curves so accurately that buildings designed in 1900 for 1930s and 1940s populations hit capacity almost precisely when the populations arrived? Normal infrastructure planning works on 10 to 15-year horizons. Civil engineers calculate projected growth, build slightly ahead of current demand, and adjust. The stations we are examining were built 50 to 70 years ahead of the demand that would eventually justify them. That gap deserves examination. Consider the physics of the buildings themselves. Pennsylvania Station in New York, completed in 1910 and demolished in 1963, one of the most debated architectural losses in American history, covered 8 city blocks. Its waiting room was larger than the nave of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The structure required 500,000 cubic feet of granite, 27,000 tons of steel, and 150 million bricks. In 1910, Pennsylvania Railroad was profitable. It was one of the largest corporations in the United States. The financial capacity existed. But financial capacity and scale logic are separate questions. A corporation builds to need or to reasonable projection of need. Pennsylvania Station was built to a scale that the railroad's own ridership projections, available in their annual reports from that period, did not independently justify. The ridership grew into it. Eventually. But something about the timeline resists easy explanation. When you stand inside photographs of these stations, and the photographs from opening decades are worth studying carefully, there is a consistent visual quality that appears across all of them. The spaces are enormous. The crowds, even at peak hours in early photographs, are small relative to the volume around them. People move through these buildings like visitors in a cathedral, not because the buildings are empty, but because the buildings were not built for the people who were there. They were built for a population density that had not yet arrived. The engineering precision compounds this. Union Station in Washington was built with ventilation systems calculated for sustained crowd densities of a scale the station would not see for 3 decades. The mechanical infrastructure, the hidden architecture, the systems below the grandeur, was not decorative. It was functional. It was sized for use, not for appearance. Grand Central's infrastructure runs 7 stories below street level. The construction required redirecting underground streams, rerouting existing rail lines, and building a system of ramps, concourses, and platforms that operated as a city beneath a city. The design was conceived by engineers who calculated pedestrian flow volumes for numbers that, at the time of design, did not exist in the ridership data. They were correct. The flows eventually arrived. But the precision of the preparation, the specificity of the engineering for a future demand they apparently anticipated with remarkable accuracy, sits uncomfortably against what we know about how infrastructure is typically conceived, funded, and approved. Buildings are approved by committees. Committees require justification. Justification requires data. The data available at the time of these projects did not independently support the scale of what was built. Something closed that gap. Whether that something was visionary urban planning, access to longer-range demographic modeling than historians have fully examined, or something else entirely, the records do not give a clean answer. What the records give, consistently, across city after city, station after station, is a pattern of preparation so specific, so detailed, so structurally committed to a future that had not yet materialized, that the standard explanation, build ahead of demand, begins to feel less like an answer and more like a starting point. The question of what came before the demand is one these buildings seem to be asking still. Washington and New York are easy to explain away individually. Large cities, large ambitions, large money. The story writes itself cleanly enough that most people never look further. The pattern becomes harder to dismiss when you leave the major metropolitan centers. In 1914, the city of Kansas City, Missouri had a population of approximately 250,000 people. It was a growing city, a rail hub by geography, positioned at the intersection of several major lines moving goods and passengers across the interior of the continent. By any reasonable measure, it warranted a serious train station. What it received was something else. Kansas City Union Station, completed in 1914, was the third largest rail station in the United States at the time of its opening. Its total floor area exceeded 850,000 square feet. Its main waiting room, a single room, measured 305 feet long, 95 feet wide, and rose to a ceiling height of 95 feet. The station contained its own hospital, its own police department, a barber shop, a pharmacy, a hotel, a ballroom, and service infrastructure designed to support populations moving through in volumes that no existing or projected Kansas City ridership number at the time could account for. It was not built for Kansas City. Or rather, it was built for a version of Kansas City that did not yet exist, and would not exist for decades. The station eventually filled. Peak usage in the 1940s brought it close to the capacity its designers had prepared for. But those designers were working in 1910, 1911, 1912. They were preparing infrastructure for a demand curve they would never personally witness being validated. That is a specific kind of confidence. And it appears, with striking consistency, wherever this period of rail construction is examined closely. Across the Atlantic, the pattern does not simply repeat. It intensifies. Pancras Station in London, completed in 1868, was built at a moment when the Midland Railway was in active competition with established lines for London terminus access. The commercial pressure was real. The need was genuine. What was not commercially required, what exceeded every functional justification the railway's own financial position could support, was the structure that was actually built. The train shed roof at St. Pancras was, at the time of completion, the largest single-span iron roof in the world. Its arch stretched 243 feet across without internal support columns. The engineering required for this span had no precedent in railway construction. It drew on techniques developed in exhibition hall construction, temporary structures designed for events, not for permanent daily use infrastructure carrying coal, freight, and passengers through the weather of northern England. The choice was not economical. The choice was not modest. And it was not, in the simplest sense, necessary. A functional roof of conventional design would have served the same trains, the same passengers, the same freight. The decision to build the largest span in the world was a decision made by people operating with a logic that conventional competitive railway economics does not fully explain. Ann Street Pancras is not the outlier in British railway architecture. It is the most visible example of a building philosophy that was applied, with remarkable consistency, to stations serving cities of vastly different sizes and commercial importance throughout the second half of the 19th century. Bristol Temple Meads, Huddersfield Station, Newcastle Central. These are not London. These are not imperial showcase cities. Huddersfield, in the mid-19th century, was a textile manufacturing town in West Yorkshire with a population numbering in the tens of thousands. Huddersfield Railway Station, opened in 1850, was designed by James Pigott Pritchett and has been described by architectural historians as one of the finest neoclassical facades in England. Its portico features 6 Corinthian columns. Its symmetrical wings extend to either side in a composition more commonly associated with civic palaces and national museums than with a working railway stop in an industrial mill town. No ridership number from 1850 West Yorkshire explains Corinthian columns. No competitive railway pressure in that market explains a portico designed with the proportions of a government building in a capital city. The justification, if one exists in the records, is aesthetic and civic rather than functional. Someone decided that the arrival point by rail, even in a textile town, even in a mid-sized northern English city, warranted architecture of this particular weight and permanence and classical reference. And that decision was made consistently. Across towns. Across regions. Across a country that was simultaneously building some of the most utilitarian industrial infrastructure in human history, factories, warehouses, gasworks, sewage systems built to function and nothing more. The same culture that produced purely utilitarian industrial architecture produced, specifically and selectively, railway stations of extraordinary architectural ambition. That selective application of grandeur is itself a pattern worth examining. When American and British examples are placed alongside each other and examined for shared characteristics, several consistencies emerge that the individual national narratives do not fully account for. First, scale disproportionate to contemporary demand, consistently validated by future demand arriving decades later. Second, construction techniques and materials that represented, in many cases, the absolute technical frontier of what was achievable, not what was practical or economical, but what was possible at the limits of the engineering knowledge of the period. Third, a spatial philosophy treating the experience of arrival and departure as something requiring grandeur, permanence, and civic weight far exceeding anything the commercial function of rail travel strictly demanded. Fourth, and this is where the pattern becomes most difficult to fit neatly into standard infrastructure narratives, a consistency of this philosophy across buildings that had no common client, no common architect, no common government mandate, and in some cases, no awareness of each other's existence during the design and construction periods. The same instinct, applied independently, across an ocean, across different political systems, across different economic pressures, arriving at the same conclusion about what a train station should be, and how large and how permanent. Some researchers who study this period of construction have begun grouping these patterns under a broader interpretive framework. A way of asking whether what looks like independent parallel development might instead reflect something shared that the standard histories have not yet fully named. That framework has a label. And the label and what it means and does not mean is where this examination has been heading all along. The label is Tartaria. It is worth being precise about what that word is and what it is not before it is used any further, because the word carries significant interpretive weight in certain corners of historical discussion. And that weight can distort the examination if it arrives before the evidence has been properly laid out. Tartaria, in the context of mainstream historical scholarship, refers to a geographic designation used extensively in European cartography from roughly the 13th through the 18th centuries. On maps produced during this period, maps published by serious cartographic institutions, maps used by navigators and diplomats and military planners, a vast territory stretching across Central Asia, Siberia, and portions of Eastern Europe was labeled Tartaria, or Tartary, or some variation of that name. The label appeared on French maps, British maps, Dutch maps. It was not a fringe designation. It was a standard cartographic term for a real geographic region populated by real people across an enormous span of land. That is the historical baseline. That is what the word originally meant. What the word has come to mean in certain contemporary discussions is something considerably more contested. In online communities devoted to alternative historical interpretation, Tartaria has become an organizing label for a broader set of questions. Questions about the origins of certain architectural styles, certain infrastructure patterns, certain technological capabilities that appear, in the historical record, earlier or at greater scale than conventional timelines seem to account for. The grand rail stations are frequently cited within these discussions. The Corinthian columns in Huddersfield, the Roman imperial proportions in Washington, the unprecedented engineering spans in London, the over-prepared mechanical infrastructure in New York. Within these interpretive communities, one reading of these patterns suggests that the architectural and engineering consistency visible across 19th-century rail construction reflects an inheritance, a cultural, technical, or organizational continuity from a prior civilization or administrative system that has not been fully accounted for in standard historical narratives. It is important to state clearly what that claim is and is not. It is not, in its more careful formulations, a claim that history was deliberately falsified. It is not, in its more careful formulations, a claim that a specific empire was erased from the record by identifiable actors with identifiable motives. The more considered versions of this interpretive framework are asking a structural question: whether the explanatory models historians currently use are complete enough to account for what the physical record actually shows. That is a different kind of claim. And it is a claim that deserves to be engaged with on its own terms, rather than dismissed because of the more sensational versions that surround it in popular discussion. Mainstream historians and architectural scholars offer their own explanations for the patterns this documentary has traced, and those explanations are substantive. One interpretation centers on the concept of civic identity as infrastructure. The argument holds that 19th-century industrialization produced enormous anxieties about what cities were becoming: chaotic, crowded, polluted, morally disorienting, and that monumental public architecture served a psychological and social function that was consciously understood by the people commissioning it. You built grandly not because the function required it, but because the population needed to feel that civilization was advancing rather than deteriorating. The station was not just a transport hub. It was an argument about what the future was going to look like. Under this interpretation, the scale and the classical references and the unprecedented engineering were deliberate civic statements. Investments in collective psychology rather than transport efficiency. The ambition was the point. The excess was intentional. This explanation accounts for much of what we have examined. It explains the Corinthian columns in Huddersfield. It explains the Roman imperial references in Washington. It explains why a competitive railway company in England would spend money it did not strictly need to spend on a roof span the world had never seen before. What it explains less cleanly is the engineering specificity. The mechanical infrastructure sized for populations not yet present. The ventilation systems calculated for crowd densities decades away. The pedestrian flow modeling that proved accurate for demand that did not exist at time of design. Civic symbolism explains grandeur. It does not, on its own, explain precision. A second mainstream interpretation focuses on the specific culture of Victorian and Edwardian engineering and architecture as a professional class. The argument is that the engineers and architects of this period operated within a professional ethos that treated overbuilding as a virtue rather than a waste, that the training, the professional norms, and the competitive culture of the field produced individuals who systematically built beyond present need as a matter of disciplinary pride and professional identity. This interpretation has real evidential support. The correspondence and professional writings of engineers from this period do reflect an ethos of permanence, of building for centuries rather than decades, of treating the future as an obligation rather than a speculation. But professional ethos, even a strong one, does not fully account for the accuracy of the preparation. Ethos explains the impulse to build large. It does not explain why the largeness proved, repeatedly and specifically, to be the right size for a future the builders could not have observed. And so the pattern remains, sitting in the record, visible in the structures themselves, many of which still stand, still function, still move passengers through spaces that were designed for them before they existed. Some researchers look at this pattern and see evidence of extraordinary visionary planning within well-understood historical processes. Some look at it and see a civic and professional culture expressing values that had little to do with transport efficiency. Some look at it and reach for the Tartaria label, not as an answer, but as a placeholder for a question they feel has not yet been adequately addressed by the standard frameworks. What none of these interpretations fully resolve is the simplest version of the question. How did they know how many people were coming? Not approximately. Not directionally. With the kind of specificity that shows up in ventilation calculations and pedestrian flow modeling and mechanical infrastructure sized for peak loads that arrived on schedule 30 and 40 years after the buildings opened. The structures stand. The proportions are measurable. The timelines are documented. The explanation for why the preparation was so precise remains, depending on which framework you find most credible, either a testament to the extraordinary foresight of a generation of builders, or a question that the historical record has not yet answered in a way that fully closes. The stations are still there. Still, in some cases, exactly the right size. And still, if you stand in them quietly and look up at the ceilings that were built for you before anyone knew you would come, still asking something that feels like it should have a simpler answer than the one we have.